Back. We're here for chapter 13, section number 2, which is a continuation of our study of medieval Europe. And in this case, what we're taking a look at is the concept of feudalism in Europe. It's a very complicated system, so I'm going to try to do my best to simplify it for you so you can have a pretty good understanding of what was going on during the Middle Ages. Well, really, the factor that we have to really understand here, I'd say the key point here in the beginning is that feudalism came about because of the multiple and numerous invasions that were happening on Western Europe during this time. So that's where it starts with Roman numeral 1, invaders attack Western Europe. So feudalism is actually a political system in which nobles, these wealthy, large landowners already, are actually granted the use of lands that legally belong to the king in exchange for their loyalty, their military service, and their vow of protection for the people who live on the land that's granted to them. So here's the real thing. The idea is that there's so many invasions that are happening on Western European kingdoms that the king just simply, he can't defend it all himself with his army. He has a private army, he has an army of the kingdom, but still it's not getting the job done. So what he needs to do is he needs to provide these nobles with parcels of land. The incentive for them is that they get to use this land. They can grow crops on it. They can utilize the land for whatever they would like to make money, but they have to protect that portion of land from outside invasion. So they basically have the task of creating their own army of knights, which we'll learn about here shortly, to protect said land. Okay, that's basically what feudalism is. It's a sharing by the king of his land. It's a division of his land. He still is the king, but he's giving nobles this power to protect portions of his own land. So let's take a look at some of the invasions first, and then we'll talk further about feudalism as we go throughout the lesson. From the years 800 to about 1000, invasions significantly destroyed the Carolingian Empire that we learned about in section 1. Muslim invaders from the south took over places like Sicily and then the rest of modern Italy. They sacked Rome in the year 846. A group of invaders called the Magyars, which kind of come from modern day Hungary, they attacked from the east. And then from the north, of course, came the Vikings. So they were devastating some of their attacks. So we'll take a look at, here's a Viking ship, by the way, a Viking longboat. It's really low. It's not too deep, so it could travel in very shallow waters like rivers and streams. It allowed the Vikings to get inland and make very big surprise attacks. So that's really one of the things that Vikings were good at. They didn't have a whole lot of numbers, but what they were really good at is kind of sneaking up on you, raiding quickly, and then getting back on their longboats and out of there. They were looking for treasure more so than anything else. They really weren't looking to stick around for all that much time. Okay, so the Vikings come from Scandinavia. They're outlined in purple. You can see that because of their longboats, they could really get into a lot of different areas, and they can get inland going and sailing through rivers. You can see that right here through Russia. You can see that up in here, modern day Ukraine. You can see coming up here into Northern Europe in what's modern day Germany, and then into France and England, of course, as well. The Muslims are here in the gold. They made a lot of attacks from the south here in southern Spain. They came up into the islands of Corsica and Sardinia. Corsica is now part of France. Sardinia is also, but it was part of Italy for a while. Sicily, here's the island of Sicily, and then eventually Italy. And then the Magyars, kind of coming from the Danube River region, kind of modern day Hungary, they attacked into these areas as well. Okay, so let's talk about the Vikings first. Of course, I showed you on the map that they attacked from the north. They come from Scandinavia, which is a wintry, wooded region in northern Europe. It's marked by the modern day countries or regions of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The Norsemen or Northmen, which are also known as the Vikings, were also can be considered a Germanic tribe. They're Germanic style peoples. The Romans would have considered them barbarians. Viking longboats, as I said earlier when I showed you the picture, could navigate the open waters and even into shallow rivers, creeks, streams. They could get inland to destinations where they would then quickly attack and they would loot and plunder. The Vikings were mostly a warrior society, but some Viking civilizations and groups did practice trade and farming, and there also were a sector of Vikings that were known for exploring. The Viking chief Leif Erikson, for example, is believed to have reached North America around 1000 AD. That would be, if that's true, we don't have a whole lot of evidence for that, but if that is true, that would be about 500 years before Columbus. So one of the big factors that led Vikings to stop their terrorizing raids in Western Europe was a steady warming of the climate, which allowed their homelands the ability to grow greater crops that are edible. And then also the spread of Christianity. A lot of Vikings eventually converted to Christianity, started to embrace the nonviolent movements and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Talk about the Vikings, what their goal was: get in, get loot, get plunder, get food, get out. Okay, that was really one of their goals. Did they stay in some spots? Yes. But for the most part, they're attack, raid, get loot, get back home. Okay, the Magyar attacks are a little bit different. The Magyars were nomadic peoples from modern day Hungary. They were pretty skilled horsemen. They swept into Europe in the late 800s, coming from the east, of course. And their goal was generally to take captives in battle, and then they would sell those captives as slaves. Okay, and they were doing these attacks in the lands of modern day Italy, modern day France, modern day Germany. So their goal also wasn't really to stay and settle, but rather to gain slaves. So an economic factor there, a terrible economic factor. Then we have Muslim attacks. The Muslims obviously came from the southern regions of North Africa and the Middle East somewhat. They generally attacked through Spain and Italy. And then they kind of, from 600 to 900, their goal was to actually conquer and settle. And then after that, they wanted to plunder European lands. So I think one of the things you have to understand for the Muslims is that they were one of the only ones that really wanted to expand and settle and stay, which means technically, if you really want to think about that, who poses the greatest threat? If I were to write a thesis on that, I would say it was the Muslim invasion of Europe, because these people don't just want to come and then get out. They want to stay. And that's a whole new element there. Okay, now, what effect did all of these invasions have on leadership in Western Europe? Well, as I said earlier, it became more localized. The king couldn't defend the entire kingdom. He had to localize some people to defend their individual lands. And that's where feudalism came into play, by giving some of those nobles and counts and dukes their own lands and their own ability to create an army to defend those lands. Now, this could backfire on a king, because a noble could use the knights and the land to gain money and then pay knights, and could pretty much develop a pretty large army of his own. He could use that army to go out and conquer other nobles, and then eventually attack and defeat even the king. So that's a really important part of this here, and that's something that we want to really take into account. Okay, your book talks about this story about this Viking named Rollo who attacked France in the year 911. And the king at the time of France, Charles the Simple, rather than trying to fight against Rollo and the Vikings, he just gave them land. And that land eventually became Normandy, which Normandy means the Northmen, and Northmen is another term for Vikings, the Norsemen, right? Northmen, Norsemen, Vikings, Normandy, and that becomes a very famous part of World War II. So I just wanted to kind of introduce that, as you guys probably did the reading there. Okay, capital A is going to talk about the structure of feudalism. I'll have more on this as we go throughout the lesson, but the feudal system was based on rights and obligations. Okay, you've got lords. Now, the lords are the nobles. Okay, they were already granted land from the king. So what the lords would do, the nobles, they would, in exchange for military protection and other services, the landowners, or the lords, the nobles, would grant a parcel of their land called a fief. So the land grant, the process of granting your land to someone else, is called a fief. A fief is land granted by a lord to a vassal. The vassal is the person receiving the land from the lord. So originally, the king is the lord. He grants a fief of land to the vassal, who's the noble. Now the noble has the land. He can divide up his land into parcels. Who's he going to give his land to? Military guys. Who are those guys? knights. So in that relationship, the lord is the noble, the fief is the small parcel of land, the vassal would be the knight. Okay, we're going to take a look at that as we go, but it's all about a system of obligations. Okay, the lord gives the land to the knight. The land that is granted, the knight then has to serve military protection for the lord's land also. That's really how the feudal system works. Okay, there's a feudal pyramid that's located on page 361. Let's take a look at that real quick. It's right down here. Okay, here is the feudal pyramid. Now this one, I'm not a huge fan of this one. I'll explain, but this one here, European feudalism, of course, starts with the king. The king gives some land to the church. Okay, the church gets some land to build monasteries, churches, okay, to grow crops for their priests, so on and so forth. But the vast majority in the feudal system went to nobles. Nobles then recruit knights. They're the next layer down. And then nobles had peasants that were called serfs that had to stay on their land and work the land. And then knights, when they get land from the nobles, they could also have serfs. Now, in Japan, which we just learned about in chapter 12, the emperor is like the king, and then you've got these guys like daimyos. And I was looking for this chart the other day in class, and I found it was in this chapter. I thought it was in chapter 12. But daimyos are like the equivalent to lords. We learned about them in the past. So they're like your nobles. Your samurai are the equivalent to your knights in Europe, and then your peasants and merchants and artisans are the equivalent to peasants and serfs in the European form. So this is pretty basic right here. It doesn't give you a whole lot of detail. It's fine, but I'm going to show you my own version of this. And this is the one that if I ask you to replicate on a quiz, this is the one that I'm looking for. So you've got the king. He owns the whole land in the kingdom. As I said earlier, he gives some of the land to the clergy, bishops, priests, cardinals. Okay, they're going to then utilize that land, as I said, for monasteries, churches, so on and so forth. But the vast majority of the land is given out to nobles right here. And then those nobles have to give the king military service and protection. How they do that is by hiring knights. The way they hire knights is they grant knights a parcel of their own land. So if the knight provides good military service based on his contract with the noble, then the knight would get a portion of that land for himself. Now, nobles have these people called serfs who are like your common folk back in the Middle Ages in the feudal society. They're your general peasants, your day laborers. They're really close to slaves. They're not technically slaves, but being a serf means you cannot leave the land that you're born on. So really, you're kind of owned by the noble. And then as knights gain their own land, if they eventually retire from fighting, if they get to that age, they've served their contract, the time period that they were supposed to serve, they could also acquire serfs to work on their land, and they become basically a noble. Okay, so that's kind of what I would ask you guys to reproduce if on the next quiz I asked you to put the feudal pyramid down on paper. Okay, we're making it through here. Knights. Knights are mounted and armored horsemen that pledge to defend their lands in exchange for fiefs. So they're going to defend land in exchange for land of their own. They're going to defend the land of the noble in exchange for their own parcel of land. That's really key to understand there. We're going to talk more about knights in section 3, which is titled Chivalry, the Code of Chivalry. So we'll take a look at how the knights kind of became knights and what they did to practice, how they fought, what was their weaponry. That's going to be all in section 3. Okay, the social classes of the feudal society. Social class during feudalism in the medieval times basically determined a person's prestige and power. In the Middle Ages, I'm going to simplify this to the best of my ability. There were 3 social classes, okay? And it's not like upper class, middle class, lower class. It's a little bit different. It's those who fought. Those were your nobles and your knights. Those are the people who pledged to the king. If you were a noble, if you were a knight, you pledged to your noble that you were going to provide military service in exchange for land of your own. Then there was the group called those who prayed. That was the church clergy members, your bishops, your priests, your monks, your nuns. They were all part of the social class known as those who prayed. Okay. And then there's also those who worked. They were really your lower class if you wanted to compare it. Those who worked were the peasants and serfs. And we're going to talk about those groups a little bit more here at the end. But social class during the medieval times, something that you generally were born into, or you could say it was hereditary, or you could say it was inherited. If your parents were those who fought, you're probably going to be pretty wealthy, pretty well off. If your parents were those who worked, you're going to be a peasant or a serf. Those who prayed don't have children. Well, some did back in those times, but some priests back in these times were allowed to be married. They had a little bit different rules, but those who were, and then there were other things, but those who worked, okay, are the peasants and the serfs. If your parents were those, you were going to be a serf or a peasant. You just really didn't have much opportunity for growth. Was there social mobility? Not much. If you were in this class right here, you could possibly get into this class, right? Because you technically should be educated to become a priest. You need to be able to read the Bible. Could a peasant or a serf become a priest? Rarely. Okay, it's a possibility, but it didn't happen very much. Okay, this concept, this key term of serf. These are people who could not lawfully leave the place where they were born. They were not officially slaves, but the food that they produced and the work that they created and did belonged to the Lord. It was the Lord's job to feed the serfs, give them housing, okay, so on and so forth. But the work that they did was in exchange for that. They didn't get paid a currency, or they didn't get paid a salary. They were paid with a place to live, a little small plot of land to grow crops on a garden, so on and so forth. Okay, where did all of this take place? What was the noble's land? What type of land did they own? It's called a manor. Okay, we're not talking about manners like your dinner time manners or saying please and thank you. The manor is a parcel of land known as the Lord's estate. This develops into an entire system. It's based on an economic system where, okay, the lords would provide serfs with housing, farmland, and protection, like the king, like we talked about at the beginning. And the serfs would then have to take care of the lord's lands, take care of the lord's animals, and perform any general maintenance on the manor. Men and women both served as serfs, by the way. Okay? Capital letter B. If you were a serf, you had a pretty tough life. Most serfs never set foot past about 25 miles outside of their original manor where they were born. A manor usually only covered a few square miles of land. I would say a typical size manor is about the size of St. Mary's campus, to be honest with you. That'd be kind of like how people lived back then. They were all on St. Mary's campus. You did everything, cultivating your fields. Imagine the football field and the other acres back behind the football field were all farmlands. You'd have a church. You'd have kind of like a little village with some housing, things of that nature. But that was really what you're looking at as far as a manor. Now, I'm going to show you guys an example of a manor on page 362, but the average sizes for these, a small manor would be probably 15 to 20 families. A large manor would be close to 30 to 45 families. Okay, let's take a look at what a manor looked like back then. This is a manor. Okay, you can take a look at the numbers if you want, but basically there's a manor house. This is where the Lord lives, the Lord's domain, if you want to call it. They'd have a church. Here's the village church right there. You'd have your peasant cottages. This is where the serfs would live. They'd be over in this range here. So it's kind of like a little village. Okay, this is where the serfs would live. You've got the Lord's domain. Again, he says all of his personal fields that were grown and all the food went to him. Then you got the peasants' crofts. These are gardens that belong for the peasants. Okay, so you can see how small these are. This is where the peasants get their food. They got to grow their own food after they finish their work for the Lord now. Okay. Then you've got a mill. A mill is located here by the water source. It's got a water wheel that turns from the running water. So that mill is going to grind grain on the inside. So that water wheel that's spinning around on the outside is going to have a ball bearing to it. Then that's going to spin another ball that's connected to a pipe that goes inside, and it spins and it grinds up the grain. So you put the wheat in there, grinds it up, and that's how you get your flour, okay, and you make your bread and the dough, so on and so forth. I'm not a farmer, so I know I'm not an expert, but that's basically how it happens. It's a water-powered mill for grinding grain right there. Number 7, you got your common pasture. This is where you take your cattle, your horse, your goats, your sheep, and they eat the grass. All right. Next is the woodland. These are the woodlands out here. Number 8, you're going to have that all outside the manor. That's going to be where you're going to do your hunting, and you're going to chop down some trees for fires and fuel. Okay. So that's what a typical manor looked like. You can see, hey, this is kind of like the size, maybe 2-3 times the size of St. Mary's campus where we go to school. All right. Next, let's go to capital C. I told you that serfs had it pretty tough, guys. Manor life was not easy. So what we want to take a look at here is that serfs had to pay what's called a lot of taxes, okay? They had to pay a grain tax. So if they wanted to use the mill to grind grain that they grew in their own field, they had to pay a tax on that. If they wanted to get married, they had to pay money to the Lord. If they wanted to go to church, they had to pay the tax. You know, when we go to church on Sundays, technically it's an obligation to pay tithes. You're supposed to pay 10% of your income to the church. That's what a tithe was. That was the tax back then. That is still the expectation. So a tithe or tithing is a church tax or a church donation. That's 1/10 of your income. Back then, this was strictly enforced. Okay. Next, crowded living conditions that you stayed in, 1 or 2 room cottages. Yes, the Lord has to give you land and housing, but the housing's crappy. Okay, they don't give you the best spots to live in. All right. And by the way, you're responsible for taking care of the Lord's animals. They live in your house. Okay, back then you slept on hay bales, and there was animals that lived in your house. The goats, the sheep, they would come in your home at night so they didn't get attacked by wolves or coyote or whatnot. And so you are living in that filth, their feces, their fleas, okay, all that stuff. You don't have showers or baths. People didn't bathe, maybe once a month they go take a swim in the river or something, but it's pretty nasty stuff. They had lice, bed bugs, all rats. Rats were very common. This is pretty gross times. I don't think I would have survived, man. Okay. Many children, unfortunately, died before they got into adulthood. The reason for that is malnutrition, very harsh lifestyle. You're working when you're 5, 6 years old. You're out in the field working. Just no education. They didn't have medicine. They didn't have surgery. They didn't understand certain things like that just yet. And they're living in densely populated areas in tight proximity. So disease is going to spread. Malnutrition is going to lead to disease. Pretty sad. The average life expectancy at this time was about 35 years of age. That's mostly due to illness and malnutrition. Okay. Now, the question that I want you guys to ponder here is why did serfs accept this harsh lifestyle? If you can come up with that answer, I'd like you to share in class on Monday. I think that's a really good question to ponder. Why did serfs accept this type of lifestyle? What is it that's keeping them down? What is it that's keeping them from trying to rebel against the Lord or their knight? Okay. All right. Thank you.